Lecture 2, A Brief History of Cognitive Psychology. So in the last class, we discussed this idea that cognition, the mind, can be examined on 3 different levels. These are David Marr's levels of analysis. So we have the computational level where we simply observe the behavior and describe it. What is the system doing? What are the inputs? What are the outputs? We have the algorithmic level where we ask, what are the representations? How might we model this process? And then we have the implementational level where we look at how the cognitive process is actually implemented in the brain, right? Because all of our psychology, all of our cognition must be grounded in the firing of neurons. And so what we're going to look at today is the history of cognitive psychology. How did we come to study the mind at these 3 levels of analysis? So if we go back to the early 1800s, the dominant belief in psychology was that the mind is, more or less impossible to study because you can't measure directly what's happening in the mind. Physics, chemistry, these fields at the time were booming, and there were phenomenon in these fields that you could measure, right? You can measure the orbit of a planet around the sun, for instance. Cognitive psychology really started as a field when Franciscus Donders, a Dutch physiologist, decided to carefully examine reaction times, or how long it takes us to respond to stimuli. And really Donders' great insight, and I'll say this a couple times in this lecture, was that by observing behavior, we can infer what's happening in the mind. And cognitive psychology is entirely based on this notion that we can have a sense of what's going on in the mind, and to some extent in the brain, by carefully examining behavior. So Donders was really interested in reaction times, how long it takes us to respond to stimuli. And he measured 2 types of reaction times: the simple reaction time, so simply responding to a stimulus, and what's called the choice reaction time. And I should say he measured other types of reaction times as well, but I'm going to compare these 2 for the purposes of this example. So what's the simple reaction time? So the idea here is that participants are simply responding to a stimulus, and Donders observed that this takes some amount of time. So the brain needs to process information for perception. In the choice reaction time task, participants are responding to a stimulus and they're making a decision, right? So that decision could be where the stimulus is on the screen, to your left or to your right. So let's just do a quick demo of how this works, and then I'll show you, how we can combine these 2 ideas to have some measure of that decision-making process. So we'll run a little experiment here. So wherever you are, I'm going to ask you to raise your right hand when you see a blue square appear on the screen, and just go for it. Doesn't matter if you're in a public place. People will think you're crazy. That's fine. So fixate on the cross, and when you see a blue square on the screen, raise your right hand. Okay, so hopefully everybody has their right hand up in the air. That's a simple reaction time task. You're simply responding to the appearance of a visual stimulus in this case. Let's do a choice reaction time task. So very similar, but what I'm going to ask you to do now is raise your right hand if you see a blue square on the right side of the screen, on the right side of the cross, or raise your left hand if you see a blue square on the left side of the cross. So now you're doing an additional thing, right? You're not only responding to a stimulus, but you're making a decision. Is the stimulus on the right or on the left? So again, please participate in this task. Don't worry if people think you're crazy for flinging your right or left hand up in the air. Here we go, fixate on the cross. Okay, and hopefully everybody has their right hand up in the air. So again, the difference there between the simple reaction time task and the choice reaction time task is that in that second case, you're doing something additional, right? You're making a decision about where the blue square is on the screen. So as I previously said, Donder's great insight, right, was that mental responses, we can't measure them directly, but we can infer what's happening in the mind by studying behavior. And so in this example, the simple reaction time task versus the choice reaction time task, the difference in reaction time reflects the mental effort to make that decision, to decide, is that blue square on the right or the left of the screen? And this is, a fundamental idea in cognitive psychology, right? We have two tasks that differ in one thing, the thing we're interested in this case, decision making. And the difference in reaction time between those two tasks reflects that decision making process. And this is called the subtraction method. And we still use the subtraction method today. It's actually sort of fundamental to cognitive neuroscience, in particular to functional neuroimaging. And so the subtraction method as defined is the cognitive effort of a mental process is the difference in reaction time between a task that involves the process and a task that involves everything but the process. So let's look at this bar plot here. So we have the time it takes us to respond to that blue square in our simple reaction time task. Let's say it's about 300 milliseconds. And of course, in the lab, we would do this over and over and over again, get many, many samples from many different people and come up with an average. And that's exactly what Donders did. On the right here, we have the time it takes us to respond to a stimulus and make a decision about where the stimulus is on the screen, on the left or on the right, for instance. And the key idea here, what the subtraction method tells us, is that the difference in reaction time between these two processes reflects the difference in task between these two behaviors. So in this case, it reflects that additional step that we had to take of making that decision that the blue square was on the left or on the right. And this was really Donder's, great gift to psychology. And again, we measure reaction times today. We use the subtraction method today to gain some insight into mental effort. So another key figure in the history of cognitive psychology who, again, sort of championed the idea that by studying behavior, we can get some insight into mental processes was Hermann Ebbinghaus. And hopefully everybody remembers Ebbinghaus from Intro Psych. He was interested in the nature of memory. And Ebbinghaus is really famous for memorizing lists of nonsense syllables. And then he would test his memory for these lists after different time periods, right? So he'd memorize a list, wait a few days, test his memory of that list. Memorize a different list, wait several weeks, and test his memory of that list. So he was like, the subject in his own experiments. And so what he was interested in was, how long do we retain information that we've learned? And he calculated something known as savings. And the equation for savings is on the screen here. And savings is simply a measure of forgetting, right? So smaller savings equals more forgetting. And the idea here is that you take the time it took you to learn the list and you subtract out the time it takes you to relearn that list when you test your memory of that list. And what he found was, the longer he waited, the smaller the savings. So the longer it took him to relearn that list that he had originally memorized. And you can see that in this figure down here, right? So imagine Ebbinghaus memorizes a list of nonsense syllables, waits 19 minutes, tests himself. He still remembers the majority of that list, and so we have a high amount of savings. Imagine he memorizes a different list, tests himself a day later. He remembers less of that list, and so savings is decreased in this case. And so Ebbinghaus plotted what is known as a forgetting curve. And it simply shows the amount of savings versus time. And you can see that in this figure here. And the general idea, right, is that you initially forget much of what you learned. And then that sort of tapers off with time. So to put that another way, when you learn new material, within hours, a few days, you forget most of that, about 70% of it. But what you do remember sticks around for a very, very long time. And this was Ebbinghaus's sort of great gift to cognitive psychology, and this has been studied in a contemporary context and shown to hold up. Again, the key idea here is that, like Donders, Ebbinghaus is measuring behavior to understand a property of the mind. So in this case, that property is memory, whereas in Donders' case, that property was decision-making. Another key figure in the history of cognitive psychology was William James. And you might remember James from Intro Psych, in that he wrote the first textbook of psychology, known as Principles of Psychology. Now, unlike Donders, unlike Ebbinghaus, James didn't conduct controlled experiments. He used introspection to study his own mind. So introspection simply means examining your own mental processes. I like to call it thinking about thinking. And one of the things James is famous for noting is that when we pay attention to one thing, this involves drawing attention away from something else. And this was really sort of the first idea that attention is kind of like a spotlight. And attention, to some extent, shapes perceptual experience. As James wrote, millions of items are presented to my senses which never enter my experience. Why? Because they have no interest in me. My experience is what I agree to attend to. So just by studying, thinking about his own mental processes, examining his own behavior, James concluded that attention actually plays a key role in perception. We have to attend to our world in order to perceive it. And this idea has proven to be wildly correct, and attention is something we'll talk about extensively in this course because it plays a fundamental role in perception and our cognitive psychology. So in the early 1900s, cognition, the mind, took a backseat to a field of psychology known as behaviorism. And behaviorism really started with Ivan Pavlov, who noted in the early 1900s that you could condition an animal, in this case a dog, to associate a neutral stimulus, like the tick of a metronome, with an unconditioned stimulus, so food. And I'm sure everybody remembers Pavlov's experiment from intro-psych. So the idea here is that Pavlov is pairing the presentation of food with the tick of a metronome over and over and over again, and soon the dog learns to associate these two stimuli. So the dog hears the metronome tick and it produces saliva. It's expecting food to appear. And of course we call this classical conditioning. And classical conditioning was followed by operant conditioning, and it led to a field known as behaviorism. Behaviorism was really championed by John Watson, an American psychologist who I believe worked at Harvard. And Watson's idea was that we don't really care about the mind. Mental structures are irrelevant. So in Watson's view, in the behaviorist view, we're born with a blank slate. And everything we do, all of our psychology, relates to learned associations. So stimulus-response relationships. We're simply learning how to respond correctly in our environment via classical conditioning and later via operant conditioning. And so in Watson's view, the only relevant question was, what's the relationship between the environment and behavior? He didn't really care about what was happening in the mind. We're just basically dumb animals responding in a way sort of by instinct to things that happen in our environment. And so Watson, of course, is notorious for running this experiment with this young child nicknamed Little Albert, who he trained to fear a white rat. And it was sort of his demo that, look, I can, take a developing human and fundamentally alter its behavior by simply having it learn this random association. So Watson sort of founded this way of thinking in psychology that the mind was irrelevant, all that mattered was behavior. And this was reinforced by B.F. Skinner's discovery of operant conditioning. And so the idea here is that behavior is shaped by reinforcement and punishment. Again, this is something that we discussed in intro-psych, right? So behaviors that are reinforced, behaviors that are followed by a reward, tend to increase. Behaviors that are punished tend to decrease. And so operant conditioning, classical conditioning, this idea that all of our behavior relates to these two processes dominated psychology for, most of the first half of the 1900s, the 20th century. And around the 1950s, things started to change. And we can sort of pin that to this one experiment that was done by Edward Tolman. So Tolman was actually a behaviorist, and he was interested in training rats to find food in a maze. And so this is, an operant conditioning task, right? You put a rat in the maze, you put food in one arm of that maze, and the rat, runs straight, turns right, finds food. So it's getting reinforcement. And so the next time you put the rat in that arm of the maze, it knows what to do. Run straight, turn right, and there's food. There's the reward, right? So this is, operant conditioning in its most basic form. Tolman, though, discovered that if he allowed the rat to explore the maze before conditioning, so if he allowed it to roam freely throughout the maze before conditioning, he could actually start the rat in any arm of the maze and it would find the food. So even though it had been conditioned to run straight and turn right to find food, if it had this initial period of exploration, you could start the rat in this arm of the maze, and it would still run straight to the food. And in this case, it's running straight and turning left. It hasn't been conditioned to do that. So how does the rat know how to do that, right? The behaviorist view is that all of our behavior relates to classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And the rat hasn't been conditioned to perform this behavior. How does it know to run straight and turn left if it starts in this arm of the maze? And so Tolman's theory was that, or hypothesis, I should say, was that in this initial exploration period, the rat builds what's called a cognitive map. And so it has this mental map, this mental representation of its environment. And so it knows that if it starts in this other wing of the maze, running straight and turning right won't lead it to food. It needs to run straight and turn left. And so here's an example that, perfectly counters behaviorism, right? The rat hasn't been reinforced, in this case, to run straight and turn left to find food. It's being reinforced to run straight and turn right to find food. Yet if we put it in this part of the maze where it needs to run straight and turn left to find food, it does that. And again, the suggestion is that the rat is drawing on this mental map. And of course, we sort of intuitively know that we have these mental maps, right? You can imagine Acadia's campus. And you can imagine, if I were to blindfold you and, plot you down in front of the KCIC and say, walk to the cafeteria, you'd be able to do that without any problem. That's because you have this mental representation of the organization of Acadia's campus. So here we have some initial evidence that our psychology, our cognition, is not solely the product of learned associations. Very important study in the history of cognitive psychology. Really, what took down behaviorism was Skinner writing a book in 1957 called Verbal Behavior. And in this book, Skinner argued that all of our language use could be explained through operant conditioning, through rewards and punishments. So what I'm doing right now, speaking to you, what you're doing right now, understanding the sound of my voice, was driven, in Skinner's view, by operant conditioning. You were rewarded at some point in your life to learn language, to understand language, to use language, and because of that, you have language. So Skinner wrote this book, he made this argument, and Noam Chomsky, a linguist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, reviewed the book, and he absolutely destroyed it. This is one of those cases where the book review is actually much more popular than the book itself. And Chomsky basically pointed out, all of the things that were wrong with Skinner's theory. So again, the behaviorist standpoint is that all of our behavior relates to our environment and acting in our world. And so, we only use language that we've heard somebody else use before and that we've been rewarded to use. And Chomsky pointed out that children often say words and sentences that they've never been rewarded for saying. And indeed, anybody in this class could at any point produce, an entirely new sentence that they haven't produced before or heard somebody else say before. And so, language is this great example of a behavior that is really the product of knowledge that's in our mind, right? We have this internal understanding of grammar, of syntax, and this allows us to, at will, create, new linguistic constructions that we've never heard somebody else produce before, that we've never been rewarded or punished for saying before. So language is clearly not simply the product of learned stimulus-response relationships. Chomsky pointed this out, and this was really what led to the downfall of behaviorism as the dominant way of thinking in psychology. And cognitive psychology as a field was born. So at around the same time, computers were being developed, and cognitive psychology, the cognitive revolution, was encouraged or promoted by the invention of computers. And that's because computers process information in stages. And so this sort of gave us a framework for how we might think about the mind. Maybe the mind processes information similarly in stages. And we have some evidence of that, right, from Donder's reaction time experiments. Clearly, by making the task more complex, it takes us more time to react. So that's some suggestion that, different mental processes take different amounts of time, and that cognitive psychology, the way we think, really relates to staged processing of information. A very famous experiment by Colin Cherry really led to the application of this information processing approach to psychology. And this experiment is known as dichotic listening. We'll talk a lot in this course about this particular experiment, so if it doesn't make perfect sense right now, that's okay, we'll come back to it. And the idea here is that in dichotic listening tasks, you're hearing two different streams of audio, one in each ear, and you have to attend to one of those streams. And so it allows us to investigate the role of attention in perception, right? Because you're attending to one of the streams, let's say the stream in your left ear, and after the experiment, we can ask you, well, did you actually perceive anything from the ear that you were not attending to? And so this experiment led to a very famous model known as Broadbent's filter model of attention. And again, the idea here is that we're taking this information processing approach to studying cognition. So, like a computer processes information in stages, right? We have some input, an input processor. This information goes to a memory unit. This information might go to an arithmetic unit, right? That performs some sort of computation, and then we get some output. So in the same way that we can describe how a computer processes information, we can take a mental process like attention, perception, and break it down into steps, right? So we have some input. Attention acts like a filter, so only the things that we're attending to get passed on to perception. Perception in this case is like a detector. And then the things that we perceive, the things that we detect, are passed on to memory. And we still use this information processing approach today to, think about different mental processes, to model them, and to test different aspects of our models. So for instance, Broadbent's filter model of attention, right? It makes a very clear prediction that we only perceive things that we're attending to. And so this led to actually a bunch of experiments that we'll talk about that test that idea. Is that true? Do we really only perceive things that we are attending to? And we'll get into that when we discuss attention. Another famous model in psychology that used this information processing approach was developed by Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968. And in this case, it was a memory model. And you may remember this from intro psych. But again, the idea here is that we're taking one cognitive process, in this case memory, and we're breaking it down into stages. So Atkinson and Shiffrin broke memory down into sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. And by doing this, we're first of all accounting for observable behavior, right? It takes some time to commit information to long-term memory. And that's reflected in this model, right? Information moves through the model in stages. This must take time. And this model, again, allows us to make very, very precise predictions about human behavior that we can then test. So this model posits, for instance, that there's a distinction between short-term memory and long-term memory. Do we actually see that in the lab? And as we'll discuss in this course, yeah, we do. Is there actually a distinction between sensory memory and short-term memory? And we'll look at that, in this course. And again, by taking this information processing approach, by modeling behavior in steps, this allows us to make very clear hypotheses, very clear testable predictions that, really, I would argue, have advanced cognitive psychology. Finally, in the 1980s, new methods were developed for actually looking at mental processes happening in the brain to some extent. Right? So this problem that, psychologists of the 1800s thought could never be solved, examining the mind, to some extent now we have the capability to actually look at what's happening in the brain during cognitive behaviors. And so this new field, which involves both studying behavior and studying what's happening in the brain during behavior using, for instance, functional neuroimaging like fMRI or MEG. This new field is called cognitive neuroscience. And the whole idea here is that cognitive neuroscience examines how mental processes are implemented in the brain. So we're interested in not only examining behavior, but also what's happening in the brain during cognitive behaviors. And the image at the bottom of the slide here simply shows some data from a very famous study that we'll talk about, which suggests that there's a part of our brain that specifically responds to face perception. And the image on the top right, of course, shows an fMRI scanner. So that was a whirlwind tour of the history of cognitive psychology. We've come to the end of the lecture and the lecture quiz and review. And so I plan to end all the lectures in this course with little quizzes like this. And so what I would suggest is that after I read the question, you simply, pause the playback of the video, think about the answer for a little bit, maybe jot down your answer, and then I will go through the answer. And this is just to sort of give you some sense of whether you've, actually taken in, understood what we've discussed in this particular lecture. So question 1, who performed the first cognitive psychology experiment and what did it involve? Question 1, who performed the first cognitive psychology experiment and what did it involve? So Franciscus Donders measured reaction times to examine mental processes. And the key idea here, right, is that we can examine behavior, we can carefully study behavior to understand what's happening in the mind. And we still do this today. We still measure reaction times in the lab today. I measure reaction times in my experiments that I run here at Acadia. Question 2. So Donders invented something called the subtraction method. What is the subtraction method? Question 2. Donders invented the subtraction method. What is it? So the subtraction method posits that mental processes reflect the difference in reaction time between a task that involves the process we're interested in and a different task that involves everything but that process. Right? So if we want to study decision-making in response to some sort of visual stimulus, we need our decision-making task, is the blue square on the left or on the right, and we need a comparable task that includes all aspects of that initial task except for the thing we're interested in, except for that decision. Right? So we need a task where you're just responding to a blue square. Do you see a blue square? Yes or no? And the difference in reaction time between those two tasks reflects the mental process that we're interested in studying, reflects decision-making in this case. Question 3, what is the information processing approach in psychology? So this approach that was motivated by the development of computers process information in stages. What is this approach? How do we apply it? Question 3, what is the information processing approach? I sort of gave it away a little bit in my description of the question, but the central idea here is that we're actually processing information that we receive, right? We're not just responding to stimuli in a very sort of conditioned stimulus response type of way. And fundamentally, what this approach suggests is that we can take a cognitive process like memory and like attention and break it down into discrete stages. And we can depict these stages in a flow diagram, a box and arrow diagram, and these diagrams lead to very nice testable predictions. So they allow us to develop experiments that give us more insight into what's happening in the mind.